Picture this, yours. You're standing on the misty shores of a Norwegian fjord in the year 922 AD, the cold wind whipping through your hair as longships bob in the dark waters. The air smells of salt and smoke, and in the distance you hear the low chants of a funeral rite echoing off the cliffs. A great Viking chieftain has just died, his body laid out on a massive wooden ship, surrounded by his weapons, treasures, and the loyal warriors who served him. But as you draw closer, pushing through the crowd of fur-clad mourners, your eyes lock on something that makes your stomach turn. A young woman, dressed in fine linens and adorned with silver jewellery, being led toward the pyre. She's not just any mourner, she's his wife, or perhaps one of his concubines, and what she's about to endure is one of the most brutal traditions in Viking history. Whispers ripple through the gathering. She must join him in death, her life sacrificed to serve him in the afterlife. This isn't some romantic tale of eternal love, it's a horrifying ritual of control, power, and unimaginable suffering that reveals the dark underbelly of Viking society. Before we dive deeper into this forgotten chapter of history, if you enjoy uncovering these hidden truths that challenge everything we think we know about the past, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more stories like this. And please drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from. It's amazing how these ancient tales connect us across oceans and centuries, from the fjords of Scandinavia to wherever you are right now. What you're about to hear isn't just another myth about fierce warriors and epic sagas. It's the stark reality of what happened to Viking women when their husbands died. A practice so disturbing that even contemporary observers from other cultures recorded it with shock and revulsion. We're talking about ritual sacrifice, forced participation in death rites, and the systematic erasure of women's autonomy in a world where honour and the afterlife trumped human life. The name might not be as famous as Ragnar Lothbrok or Lagertha from those TV shows, but the stories of these women will stay with you, a testament to the cruelty hidden behind the Viking legend. Let's start by setting the stage in the Viking Age, that tumultuous period from roughly 793 to 1006 AD, when Norse raiders, traders and settlers spread across Europe like a storm from the north. These weren't just barbaric pillagers, they had a complex society built on clans, longhouses, and a deep reverence for their gods, Odin, Thor, Freya and the rest. Marriage in this world was more than a union of hearts. It was a strategic alliance, often arranged to strengthen family ties, secure land or build political power. Women, especially those of high status, were valued for their roles in managing households, weaving textiles that were as crucial as any sword, and bearing children to continue the bloodline. But beneath this veneer of domestic importance lurked a darker truth. Women were property, their fates tied inexorably to their husbands. When a man died, or whether in battle, from old age or disease, his widow didn't just grieve, she was thrust into a web of rituals that could end her life. Historical accounts, like those from Arab traveller Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who witnessed a Viking funeral on the Volga River, paint a vivid picture of these events. Ibn Fadlan, a Muslim diplomat sent by the Caliph of Baghdad, encountered a group of Rus's Vikings, Norse settlers in what is now Russia, and documented their customs with a mix of fascination and horror. In one chilling entry, he describes the funeral of a chieftain, where a young slave girl volunteers or is coerced to be sacrificed alongside her master. But was this limited to slaves? Not always. Sagas and archaeological evidence suggest that in some cases, wives or high-ranking women faced similar fates, especially if they had no children or if clan honour demanded it. Imagine being that woman. You've spent years in a longhouse tending the fire, negotiating with traders, perhaps even fighting alongside your husband in raids if you were one of the legendary shield maidens. Your life has been one of hardship and resilience, surviving harsh winters, famine, and the constant threat of invasion. Now, with your husband's death, everything changes. The community gathers, not just to mourn, but to ensure his spirit journeys to Valhalla or the halls of the gods with proper accompaniment. The belief was strong. A great man needed servants, animals, and yes, women in the afterlife to maintain his status. Sacrifice wasn't seen as murder but as a sacred duty, a way to honour the dead and appease the gods. But for the women involved, it was terror, incarnate. Preparations would begin immediately after the husband's death. The body was washed, dressed in fine clothes, and placed in a temporary grave or on a ship while the funeral ship was prepared, a process that could take days or weeks. During this time, the widow or chosen woman was treated like royalty, given the best food, drink, and even sexual freedoms with the men of the tribe, as if to give her a final taste of life's pleasures before the end. Ibn Fadlan notes how the girl in his account was plied with intoxicating drinks, her mind clouded as she was led through the rites. But let's not romanticize this. It was manipulation, a way to dull resistance and ensure compliance. The psychological pressure was immense. Family honor, threats of disgrace, or beliefs in the afterlife could force even the strongest woman to submit. Some sources hint at widows who chose this path willingly, seeing it as a way to reunite with their beloved or escape a life of widowhood, which in Viking society often meant poverty, remarriage to a lesser man, or enslavement. But how many were truly willing? The line between choice and coercion was razor thin in a patriarchal world where women's voices were rarely recorded. As the funeral day approached, the tension built. The ship was loaded with the chieftain's possessions, weapons, horses, often sacrificed alive, dogs, and treasures from distant lands. The woman was adorned in her finest brooches, beads, embroidered dresses, a macabre bridal preparation for death. Chants filled the air, invoking the gods, while the community watched, some with grief, others with a grim acceptance of tradition. This wasn't universal across all Viking groups, evidence varies by region. In Scandinavia proper, graves show women buried with honour but not always sacrificed. But among the Rus and some seafaring clans, the practice was documented, leaving us with artefacts like the Oseberg ship burial, where 2 women were interred with riches, though debate rages on whether they were sacrificed or died naturally. What we do know is that these rituals reinforced male dominance, turning women's bodies into extensions of their husbands' legacies. The act itself was brutal. The woman was often strangled, stabbed, or both, her body placed beside her husband's before the ship was set ablaze or buried. Ibn Fadlan describes the slave girl being lifted to peer into the afterlife, claiming to see her master calling her, before being killed by an old woman known as the Angel of Death, a figure who wielded the knife with ritual precision. Blood would flow, mixing with the offerings, as flames consumed everything. The smoke rising to the sky was believed to carry their spirits to the gods. But think about the human cost, the fear in her eyes, the final moments of realization, the pain of betrayal by her own community. This wasn't glory, it was horror, a tradition that stripped women of agency even in death. As we peel back these layers, it becomes clear that Viking society, for all its celebrated fierceness, harboured practices that would shock us today. And yet these stories survived, whispered through time, reminding us of the resilience of those who endured. But there's more to uncover, the specific roles wives played, the variations in rituals, and the rare tales of those who escaped this fate. As we delve deeper into the shadows of these Viking death rites, let's focus on the specific roles that wives and concubines were expected to play, not just as mourners, but as active participants in a theatre of death that blurred the lines between devotion and destruction. Remember, in Viking culture, a man's status in the afterlife was thought to mirror his earthly power, so his journey to the other side demanded elaborate preparations. For the widow, this meant stepping into a role that was part sacrificial lamb, part eternal companion. She wasn't merely burying her husband, she was being buried with him, her life force offered up to ensure his comfort in Valhalla or whatever realm the gods decreed. But let's break this down step by step, drawing from the sagas, archaeological finds, and those rare eyewitness accounts that survived the centuries. First, consider the immediate aftermath of the husband's death. The body would be preserved, sometimes with herbs or in a temporary grave, while the community mobilized. The wife, if she was the primary consort, often took charge of initial preparations, overseeing the gathering of grave goods. This might sound empowering, but it was laced with dread. She knew that in some clans, particularly among the more warlike groups like the Rus Vikings, the question would soon arise: who would accompany the dead? Slaves were common choices, especially thralls captured in raids, but for a chieftain of high standing, a wife or favoured concubine elevated the ritual's prestige. The decision wasn't always hers. Elders, shamans, or the deceased's kin would convene, weighing factors like her fertility, her loyalty during life, and whether she had borne heirs. If she had strong sons, she might be spared to guide them. If not, her value shifted from living asset to afterlife servant. The psychological manipulation began subtly but intensified. She would be isolated from her usual support network, surrounded instead by ritual attendants, often older women who served as seeresses or midwives to the dead. These figures, like the angel of death described by Ibn Fadlan, were both caretakers and executioners, whispering tales of glory in the halls of the gods while preparing her mind for the end. Intoxicating mead or herbal concoctions were administered, not just to ease pain but to induce visions or compliance. Imagine her state, grief-stricken, perhaps still in shock from her husband's passing, now bombarded with prophecies that painted death as a reunion, a noble sacrifice that would immortalize her name in songs and sagas. But beneath the flattery lay coercion, threats that refusing would curse the family line, bring shame, or even lead to her being cast out as a coward, left to starve in the unforgiving wilderness. As days turned to weeks, her preparation became a grotesque parody of a wedding. She was bathed in scented waters, her hair braided with silver threads, her body anointed with oils from distant trades. Fine garments were sewn, tunics of wool and linen, adorned with amber beads and intricate brooches that symbolized her status. Jewelry from her husband's hoard was draped around her neck, wrists heavy with arm rings that once signified protection but now felt like chains. This adornment served a dual purpose: to honor her in death and to display the clan's wealth, ensuring the gods took notice. But for her, each piece was a reminder of finality, a costume for her own execution. Historical evidence from graves like the one at Gokstad in Norway shows women buried in such finery, their skeletons bearing marks that suggest violent ends, strangled necks, stabbed torsos, hinting at the ritual's brutality. The sexual elements of the rite, as recorded by Ibn Fadlan, add another layer of horror. The chosen woman was sometimes encouraged or forced to engage in intimacies with the men of the tribe, a final indulgence framed as a gift from the gods. This wasn't about pleasure, it was a ritual purification, a way to transfer life essence or appease spirits. For a wife, this could be doubly humiliating, violating her fidelity even as she mourned. Ibn Fadlan recounts the slave girl in his narrative going from tent to tent, each encounter ending with the man proclaiming, "Tell your master I did this out of love for him." It's a chilling detail, revealing how women's bodies were commodified, their autonomy sacrificed on the altar of male legacy. Scholars debate if this was widespread or specific to certain groups, but runic inscriptions and saga fragments suggest similar practices in Scandinavia, where fertility rites intertwined with death customs. As the funeral pyre or ship was readied, the woman's role shifted to that of a prophetess. She would be lifted 3 times to a doorway or platform, each time peering into the other world and describing visions, seeing her ancestors, her husband waiting, paradises of green fields and golden halls. This was theatre, designed to convince the crowd, and perhaps herself, of the rite's righteousness. But doubt creeps in through the historical record. Some accounts whisper of women who resisted, who had to be bound or drugged to comply. The execution itself was swift but savage. The angel of death would approach with a cord for strangling and a blade for the heart, assisted by strong men who held the victim down. Blood was collected in bowls as offerings, her body arranged intimately beside her husband's, sometimes embracing as if in eternal sleep before the flames or earth claimed them. Archaeology supports this grim tableau. The Oseberg ship burial from 834 AD contained 2 women, one elderly and one younger, surrounded by sleds, tapestries, and sacrificed animals. The younger woman's bones show signs of possible violence, leading some to speculate she was a consort sacrificed to accompany the older, perhaps a queen. Carbon dating and DNA analysis reveal these weren't isolated incidents. Similar graves dot Sweden, Denmark, and beyond, with women interred alongside men in positions that suggest they weren't willing participants. Yet not all wives met this fate. In more settled communities, like those in Iceland described in the Laxdæla saga, widows could remarry, inherit property, or even lead households, their value as managers outweighing sacrificial traditions. This variation highlights how geography and clan customs influenced the horror. Seafaring raiders clung to older, bloodier ways, while farmers adopted milder Christian-influenced burials by the late Viking Age. The emotional toll on these women must have been profound. Picture her final hours, the chants growing louder, the smoke from preliminary sacrifices stinging her eyes, the weight of expectation crushing her spirit. Was there regret, defiance hidden behind a stoic facade? We can only infer from the silence of history where women's voices are faint echoes in male-written sagas. Some tales speak of clever widows who negotiated their way out, offering slaves in their place or invoking omens from the gods to spare them. These rare escapes offer glimmers of agency in a system designed to suppress it. But to truly understand the depth of this practice, we need to explore how it evolved across different Viking territories and the external influences that began to challenge it. From the frozen tundras of Russia to the green isles of Britain, the rituals adapted, sometimes growing more elaborate, other times fading under the shadow of a new faith. And within these variations lie stories of women who defied the odds, their acts of survival shining through the darkness. As we journey across the vast expanse of Viking influence, from the icy fjords of Norway to the river routes of Russia and the conquered lands of Britain and Ireland, it's clear that these death rituals weren't monolithic. They morphed and adapted like the longships that carried Norse culture far and wide. What began as ancient pagan customs rooted in animistic beliefs evolved under the pressures of trade, conquest, and creeping external influences, creating a patchwork of horror that varied by region, clan, and era. In some places, the sacrifice of wives became more symbolic or rare. In others, it intensified into spectacles of power. But through it all, the core remained, a system that valued male legacy over female life, with women's fates hanging on the whims of tradition and the men who enforced it. Let's explore these variations, uncovering how geography shaped the nightmare, and how some women found cracks in the armour to survive. Start with the heartland of Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden and Denmark, where the sagas and runestones provide our richest, if biased, sources. Here, among the settled farmers and fjord-dwelling chieftains, wife sacrifice appears less common than among their more nomadic kin. Graves from sites like Birke in Sweden show high-status women buried with honour, their bodies intact and adorned with keys symbolising household authority, suggesting they died naturally or were spared the knife. The Elder Edda and prose. Edda, those mythic compilations, hint at afterlife beliefs where worthy souls went to Valhalla or Folkvanga without needing human escorts. Yet even here, exceptions lurked. The saga of the Volsungs tells of Signy, who chooses death by fire rather than live in shame, echoing ritual suicides. Archaeological digs reveal occasional double burials, where women show trauma, a broken hyoid bone indicating strangulation, pointing to coerced ends. In these core territories, the practice might have been reserved for times of crisis, like after a devastating raid, when clans sought to appease angry gods with the ultimate offering. Widows with political savvy could leverage alliances, perhaps by quickly remarrying a brother-in-law to keep property in the family, as allowed under Norwegian laws like the Gulathing Code. But for those without such protections, the threat loomed like a storm cloud, a reminder that their worth was tied to their husband's pyre. Venturing eastward to the Rus territories along the Volga and Dnieper rivers, the rituals grew more elaborate and brutal, influenced by Slavic and steppe nomad customs encountered through trade. This is where Ibn Fadlan's account shines its harsh light, describing funerals as grand theatrical events witnessed by multicultural crowds. Among these Viking settlers, who blended Norse paganism with local beliefs, wife or concubine sacrifice was almost expected for chieftains, elevating the rite to a status symbol. The Angel of Death figure, often an elder woman with shamanic authority, took centre stage, her role blending midwife and executioner. Variations here included live animal sacrifices on a massive scale, horses beheaded, dogs throttled, all to stock the afterlife household. For the woman, the prelude could last up to 10 days, filled with hallucinogenic rituals involving mushrooms or henbane to induce visions. Some accounts suggest multiple women were chosen, a wife for companionship, slaves for service, their bodies arranged in a macabre tableau on the ship before ignition. The flames weren't just destructive, they were transformative, believed to forge a portal to the gods. But external observers like Ibn Fadlan noted the coercion. The girl in his tale volunteered only after intense pressure, her final cries drowned by drums. This region's isolation from Christian Europe allowed the practice to persist longer, but trade with Byzantium introduced whispers of alternative faiths, planting seeds of doubt. Turning westward to the British Isles and Ireland, where Vikings established kingdoms like Dublin and York, the rituals faced their greatest challenge. Collision with Christianity. Norse settlers, initially raiders, became rulers, intermarrying with local Celts and adopting hybrid customs. Here, wife sacrifice clashed with Christian views of the soul and burial, leading to adaptations or outright abandonment. The annals of Ulster record Viking funerals with horror, describing ships set ablaze with heathen rites, but evidence of human sacrifice is scarcer, perhaps suppressed by monastic chroniclers. In places like the Orkney Islands, chambered tombs show women buried alongside men without clear signs of violence, suggesting a shift towards symbolic offerings, weapons or effigies instead of lives. Yet holdouts persisted among purist pagan clans, especially during the early invasions. The saga of Gisli the Outlaw hints at a widow who fakes her own death to escape ritual obligations, fleeing to Iceland. Christianity's spread, accelerated by figures like Olaf Tryggvason, who converted Norway around 995 AD, began eroding these practices. Missionaries preached against barbaric sacrifices, offering baptism as salvation from both earthly and eternal fires. By the 11th century, as Vikings integrated into Christian Europe, laws like those in Iceland's Gragas prohibited human offerings, though old habits died hard in remote areas. Amid these variations, stories of defiance emerge like beacons in the fog, tales of women who subverted the system, their cunning preserved in oral traditions and later written sagas. Take the legendary figure of Aud the Deep-Minded, a 9th century Irish-Norse noblewoman who, after her husband's death, didn't submit to any pyre. Instead, she commandeered ships, led her family to Iceland, and founded a new settlement, becoming a matriarch whose lineage shaped the island's history. Her story from the Landnámabók shows how widowhood could be a path to power for those with resources and resolve. Other accounts speak of women using Seda, Norse magic, to divine omens that forbade their sacrifice, or bribing shamans to declare them unfit. In one fragment from a Swedish runestone, a widow commemorates her husband without mentioning her own death, implying she lived on to raise their children. These survivors often relied on social networks, alliances with powerful kin, or even Christian converts who hid them. But defiance came at a cost: exile, loss of status, or accusations of witchcraft. The psychological scars must have been deep, carrying the trauma of near death and the guilt of breaking sacred bonds. These acts of resistance highlight a broader truth. While Viking society glorified male warriors, women wielded subtle influence through textiles, trade and counsel, sometimes turning the tables on oppressive traditions. Yet the ritual's persistence reveals deep-seated beliefs in the afterlife's hierarchy, where women were eternal subordinates. As Christianity encroached, it didn't just change burials, it reshaped gender roles, offering women new avenues for autonomy, like monastic life or legal protections against forced rites. But to fully grasp the legacy of these practices, we must examine their long-term impact on Viking descendants and how modern archaeology is rewriting the narrative. From unearthed graves that speak of silenced voices to the ethical debates surrounding these discoveries, the story continues to unfold, challenging our romanticized views of the Norse world. As we stand on the threshold of the modern era, gazing back at these ancient rites through the lens of time, the legacy of Viking wife sacrifices casts a long, haunting shadow over history, influencing everything from legal systems to cultural myths that persist today. These practices didn't vanish overnight with the swing of a missionary's cross. They lingered in folklore, shaped gender dynamics in Scandinavian societies, and left indelible marks on the collective psyche of their descendants. But perhaps most fascinating is how contemporary archaeology and scholarship are unearthing the truth, piecing together fragments of bone and artifact to give voice to women long silenced. This isn't just academic exercise, it's a reckoning with the past, forcing us to confront how romanticized Viking lore, think horned helmets and heroic sagas, has often glossed over the brutality inflicted on half the population. Let's trace this legacy from medieval transformations to today's ethical minefields, and see how these stories of suffering continue to resonate, reminding us that history's darkest chapters often hold the keys to understanding our own world. In the immediate aftermath of the Viking Age, as Christianity took firm root across Scandinavia by the 11th and 12th centuries, the overt practice of human sacrifice was outlawed, branded as pagan savagery by the Church. Kings like Harald Bluetooth in Denmark and Olaf Haraldsson in Norway enforced conversions, sometimes violently replacing funeral pyres with churchyard burials and runes with Latin scripts. Widows, once potential victims, gained new protections under Christian laws influenced by canon doctrine, which emphasized the sanctity of life and prohibited suicide or ritual killings. The Norwegian Magnus Lagabøte's Landslov of 1274, for instance, granted women inheritance rights and protections against forced remarriage, a direct counter to earlier customs where a widow's fate was decided by clan elders. Yet, echoes of the old ways persisted in subtle forms. Folklore from Iceland and the Faroe Islands speaks of draga, undead warriors rising from graves, often tied to improper burials where companions were denied, hinting at lingering beliefs in afterlife servitude. In rural areas, widows were sometimes shunned as unlucky or pressured into convents, a softer echo of sacrificial isolation. This transition wasn't smooth. Sagas like Njal's saga depict tensions between old pagan holdouts and new Christian norms. With women caught in the crossfire, their autonomy slowly expanding but still constrained by patriarchal structures. The long-term cultural impact rippled through Europe as Viking descendants, Normans, Russ, and Anglo-Scandinavians carried diluted versions of these attitudes into their conquests. In England, after the Norman conquest of Tenex, which traced roots to Viking settlers in Normandy, laws like those under William the Conqueror reflected a blend. Women gained some property rights but remained subordinates, their value often measured by marital alliances. In Russia, the Kievan Rus state founded by Viking Varangians evolved funerary customs that mixed Slavic and Norse elements, with princesses occasionally buried with pomp but rarely sacrificed, as Orthodox Christianity stamped out pagan excesses. These shifts influenced gender roles broadly. Scandinavian countries today boast high gender equality, but historians argue this stems partly from a backlash against Viking-era oppressions, with medieval women like the Icelandic chieftainesses pushing for reforms. Literature preserved the horror too. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales nods to heathen Norse rites, while later romantic poets like Lord Byron romanticised Viking ferocity, conveniently omitting the female victims. This selective memory created the modern myth of the noble savage Viking, popularised in 19th century operas and novels, where women like Brunhilde are fierce but ultimately sacrificial figures. Enter modern archaeology, which has revolutionised our understanding since the 19th century, when excavations like the Gokstad ship in 1880 unearthed tangible evidence of these rites. Advanced techniques, DNA analysis, isotopic studies, and 3D reconstructions now reveal the human stories behind the bones. Take the Kaupang site in Norway. Graves show women with imported silks and weapons, but some bear perimortem injuries near suggesting ritual violence, their strontium isotopes indicating they were outsiders, perhaps war captives forced into death. In Sweden's Vendel period sites predating full Viking age, similar patterns emerge, with chamber graves containing couples where the woman's skeleton shows restraint marks, implying live burial. These findings challenge old assumptions. For years, archaeologists assumed double burials were loving couples dying together. But forensic anthropology now detects asphyxiation or stabbing, painting a picture of coercion. The Oseberg ship's 2 women, once thought as natural deaths, have been re-examined. The younger's fractured skull and the older's possible arthritis suggest one was killed to accompany the other, perhaps a queen and her attendant. Carbon-14 dating places this around 834 AD, aligning with peak pagan practices. Ethical debates swirl around these discoveries like storms over a fjord. Who owns these remains? Scandinavian museums grapple with repatriation demands from indigenous Sami groups, whose ancestors may have been victims of Viking expansions. Feminist scholars, like those in Judith Jesch's Women in the Viking Age, argue that interpreting these graves requires sensitivity to gender bias in historical records, which were mostly male-authored. Public exhibitions, such as the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo, now include narratives highlighting women's suffering, moving beyond warrior glory to discuss trauma and resilience. Controversies arise too. In 2017, a DNA study of a Burka warrior grave revealed the male skeleton was female, sparking debates on shield maidens and whether some women escaped sacrificial fates by taking up arms. This ties into pop culture. Shows like Vikings dramatize figures like Lagertha, who defies widowhood by leading raids, but often sanitize the darker rituals, leading to criticism for perpetuating myths. The psychological legacy is profound, influencing modern Scandinavian attitudes toward death and gender. Countries like Sweden have some of the world's lowest gender gaps, perhaps as a cultural overcorrection to historical inequalities. Therapy and literature explore Viking trauma, with authors like Margaret Atwood drawing parallels to global patriarchal violences. Globally, these stories resonate in discussions of honor killings or sati in other cultures, drawing uncomfortable links between past and present. Organizations like UNESCO protect Viking sites not just as heritage, but as lessons in human rights, emphasizing how rituals like these underscore the need for women's autonomy. Yet, amid the horror, there's inspiration in survival tales that archaeology corroborates. Isotopic evidence from Icelandic graves shows women migrating vast distances post-widowhood, rebuilding lives far from sacrificial threats. These women, through sheer will, transformed potential endings into new beginnings, their legacies etched in the land they claimed. As we wrap this exploration, it's clear these rites were more than barbarism. They were power structures that women navigated, resisted, and sometimes dismantled. But to truly honour their memory, we must reflect on what these stories teach us today, about resilience, the cost of tradition, and the ongoing fight for equality. As we reach the culmination of this harrowing journey through Viking history, it's time to step back and reflect on the profound lessons these stories impart, not just about a distant past, but about the enduring human spirit and the shadows that still linger in our modern world. These weren't mere rituals lost to time, they were stark manifestations of power imbalances that echo in contemporary struggles for gender equality, cultural preservation, and the right to self-determination. By examining the resilience of those Viking women who faced the pyre, and those who evaded it, we uncover a narrative of survival that transcends centuries, challenging us to question the traditions we inherit and the stories we choose to tell. Their experiences, pieced together from graves, sagas, and scholarly debates, serve as a mirror to our own societies, reminding us that progress is never linear, and that the fight against oppression is as relevant today as it was in the halls of a longhouse 1,000 years ago. Let's weave these threads together, honouring the forgotten by drawing connections that bridge the ancient and the contemporary, and end with a call to carry their legacy forward. At the heart of this reflection is the theme of resilience, that unbreakable spark in the women who navigated these deadly customs. While many succumbed to the knife or the flame, others wielded intelligence, alliances, and sheer willpower to rewrite their fates. Consider the saga heroines like Une the Deep-Minded, whose real-life counterpart, as confirmed by archaeological sites in Scotland and Iceland, led migrations after her husband's death, establishing farms and lineages that endured. DNA studies from sites like the Ridgeway Hill mass grave in England, a Viking execution pit, reveal women among the victims but also survivors who integrated into local populations, their genes persisting in modern Britons. These women didn't just endure, they adapted, sometimes converting to Christianity for protection, using its doctrines to argue against sacrifice as ungodly. In Greenland's Norse settlements, where harsh conditions amplified isolation, widows took on leadership roles, as evidenced by farmstead ruins showing female-managed households post-male deaths. This resilience wasn't passive, it was active defiance, a quiet revolution against a system that viewed them as expendable. Psychologically, it speaks to trauma's long shadow. Survivors likely carried PTSD-like symptoms, passing down oral warnings that evolved into cautionary tales, influencing folklore like the Icelandic ghost stories where vengeful female spirits punish patriarchal abuses. These personal triumphs highlight broader societal shifts, showing how Viking women's struggles contributed to evolving gender norms. In medieval Scandinavia, the pushback against sacrificial rites helped forge laws that empowered women, such as Iceland's Althing assemblies, where widows could speak and own land. This laid groundwork for the progressive policies seen in Nordic countries today: high female workforce participation, strong welfare systems, and gender parity in politics. Yet this progress coexists with persistent inequalities. Modern issues like domestic violence or honour-based abuses in some immigrant communities echo the coercive elements of Viking rituals, prompting organisations like Norway's Krisesenter to draw historical parallels in their advocacy work. Globally, the Viking legacy informs discussions on cultural relativism. Should we judge ancient practices by today's standards? Anthropologists argue yes, using these stories to combat similar traditions elsewhere, from widow immolation in historical India to contemporary forced marriages. UNESCO's World Heritage Sites, like the Jellingstones in Denmark, now include exhibits on gender dynamics, educating visitors on how these monuments, once symbols of male power, also entomb tales of female sacrifice. Pop culture plays a pivotal role in this legacy, both perpetuating myths and challenging them. Television series like The Last Kingdom or Norseman often portray Viking women as empowered warriors, but rarely delve into the funerary horrors, leading to a sanitized view that historians like Neil Price critique in books such as Children of Ash and Elm. Films and games, from Valhalla Rising to Assassin's Creed Valhalla, romanticize the era, but emerging media, podcasts like The History of Vikings or the documentaries on Netflix, are shifting focus, highlighting archaeological evidence of abuse to foster empathy. This cultural reckoning extends to ethical archaeology. Debates over displaying human remains, as with the Viking exhibit at the British Museum, question whether showcasing sacrificed women's bones honours or exploits them. Indigenous perspectives, particularly from Sami and Inuit groups impacted by Viking expansions, demand decolonised narratives, emphasising how Norse rituals sometimes involved conquering and sacrificing local women, as seen in Canadian Arctic finds. On a deeper level, these stories teach us about the human cost of unchecked tradition. The psychological manipulation, the drugs, the visions, the promises of glory, mirrors modern cult dynamics or abusive relationships, where coercion masquerades as choice. Reflecting on Sporus-like figures in other histories, we see patterns of identity erasure. But in the Viking context, it's the collective community's role that chills, entire clans complicit in a woman's death for honour. This prompts introspection. How do our own societies perpetuate subtle oppressions? From workplace glass ceilings to cultural expectations of sacrifice in family roles, the echoes are there. Yet there's hope in the survival stories. Women who fled to monasteries, disguised themselves as men, or built new lives, embodying a resilience that inspires activists today. Organisations like UN Women draw on such histories to advocate for global change, using Viking examples in campaigns against gender-based violence. As we conclude, remember that these Viking wives weren't just victims, they were complex individuals, mothers, weavers, traders, sometimes warriors, whose lives were cut short or forever altered by a worldview that prioritised the dead over the living. Their stories, unearthed from the soil and sagas, demand we listen, learn and act. They remind us that power can corrupt traditions into tragedies, but human will can transform suffering into strength. In sharing this, we've connected across time, from those misty fjords to your screen, united in curiosity and compassion. If these tales of hidden history have moved you, hit that like button, subscribe for more, and comment below with your thoughts. Did this change how you see the Vikings? Where are you watching from? Let's keep uncovering the past together, honouring those who endured so we can build a better future. Thank you for joining me on this journey. May their resilience inspire us all.